Entire empires can vanish in a single generation. At the end of the Bronze Age, a catastrophic event known as the Great Drought shattered the foundations of the known world. This was not a slow decline but a swift collapse that erased powerful kingdoms from Greece to Egypt. By the end of this story, you will understand the chilling connections between climate change and civilizational survival, a lesson with urgent relevance for our own time. We will uncover why bustling cities were abandoned forever and what caused mass migrations of desperate people. How does a changing climate rewrite the destiny of humanity? This was a world of kings and emperors, but their power depended on a fragile, invisible network. Across the eastern Mediterranean, royal courts communicated through a diplomatic language carved into clay tablets. These letters, discovered by archaeologists, reveal a sophisticated dialogue of alliance, marriage proposals, and even complaints about the quality of traded goods. Great sailing ships carried not just soldiers but vital commodities, their hulls filled with copper from Cyprus and precious tin from distant lands, the essential ingredients for the bronze that defined the age. This was a system of profound interdependence. The Hittites of Anatolia needed Egyptian gold, while the pharaohs in Egypt relied on Aegean olive oil and Mycenaean pottery. It was a thriving economic machine, but it ran on a very specific fuel, agricultural surplus. To support the artisans, soldiers, and scribes who made this civilization possible, farmers had to produce far more food than their own families needed. This entire intricate structure, from the grand palaces to the specialized metalworkers, was built upon a foundation of predictable harvests and stable weather. A single bad season could cause hardship, but the system could absorb that shock. The real danger was a disruption that affected everyone at once, a threat that did not recognize borders or royal seals. What happens when the rain simply stops falling, not for one season, but for generation after generation? Pinpointing the exact moment of this collapse is a task of fitting broken pieces together. The shards of evidence gathered from burned cities and abandoned ports point to a terrifyingly narrow window of time. Most scholars place the heart of the disintegration between approximately 1200 and 1150 BCE. At the great merchant city of Ugarit on the Syrian coast, archaeologists found tablets baked hard by the very fires that destroyed the city, their final messages left unsent. In the Hittite capital of Hattusa, the mighty walls were breached and the royal citadel put to the torch, never to be rebuilt. The story is the same from Greece to the Levant, a pattern of violent destruction layers uncovered in the soil, all dating to this same 50-year period. This chronological framework is our anchor. By knowing precisely when these palaces fell, we can look elsewhere for answers. We can examine tree rings from ancient logs and core samples from lake beds, searching for an environmental story that matches the archaeological one. This precise timeline turns a collection of local disasters into a single, continent-wide event, and it directs our attention to a culprit that could move so swiftly and so mercilessly. What force could possibly bring down every major kingdom within a single human lifetime? The evidence for this catastrophe was not written on any clay tablet. It was locked away in the mud at the bottom of the sea and in the silent, slow growth of cave formations. To understand the climate of 3,000 years ago, scientists become detectives, reading a natural archive hidden in places most of us would never think to look. They drilled deep into the seabed of the Mediterranean, pulling up long cylinders of sediment, layer upon layer of ancient silt that settled over millennia. In dark, quiet caves, they carefully core into stalagmites, those stone pillars rising from the floor. Each tiny layer in a stalagmite or a sea core is like a single page in a detailed diary of the ancient atmosphere. The language of this diary is written in chemistry. Scientists measure the ratios of different types of oxygen atoms, called isotopes, trapped within these layers. The specific ratio acts as a precise thermometer and rain gauge, telling us whether a given year was wet or dry, warm or cool. In lake beds across Anatolia, the heartland of the Hittite Empire, another type of clue is preserved: fossilized pollen. By counting the different pollen grains in each layer of mud, researchers can see a dramatic transformation in the landscape. The pollen record shifts abruptly, showing that forests of moisture-loving trees like oak and pine were dying off, replaced by scrubby, drought-resistant plants like sage and cheatgrass. This is the hard, physical proof of the Great Drought. It was not a few bad years, it was a profound climatic shift that lasted for generations. The data points to a multi-decade period of relentless aridity that began just before the widespread collapse and persisted through it. The timeline is unmistakable. The archaeological evidence of burning cities and the paleoclimate evidence of failing rains are two sides of the same coin, dated to the exact same 50-year window. We now have our culprit, a vast, persistent drought. But how exactly did a lack of rain, something a single kingdom might withstand, trigger the total unraveling of an entire international system? The answer lies in the most fundamental resource of any civilization: its food. The story of this great drought is written in the wood of ancient trees and the mud of vanished lakes. Deep in the Anatolian highlands, scientists study the stumps of juniper trees that have stood for centuries. Each annual growth ring is a perfect record of that year's weather. In good years with ample rain, the tree adds a thick, healthy band of new wood, but in times of drought, the ring is desperately thin, a narrow, struggling line. Around 1200 BCE, the rings in these ancient junipers begin to tell a terrifying story. They do not show a single bad year or even a few difficult seasons in a row. Instead, they reveal decade after decade of these desperately narrow rings. The trees were essentially starving for water year after year for the length of an entire human lifetime. This was not a temporary dry spell. It was a profound, long-term shift in the climate. At the very same time, another record was being laid down at the bottom of lakes. Geologists drill into the beds of the Dead Sea and other ancient basins, extracting long tubes of accumulated sediment. These cores are like a layered cake of time, and within them, they hold the history of the water itself. In layers dating to this exact period, the composition of the mud changes dramatically. Scientists find much less of the organic material that thrives in healthy, full lakes, and a great increase in fine, wind-blown dust. This dust tells a story of exposed, dry lake beds and barren landscapes, where the wind could pick up loose soil and carry it for miles. The evidence from the trees and the lakes converges into a single, undeniable conclusion. A megadrought had gripped the eastern Mediterranean. This was a climatic shock on a scale the sophisticated Bronze Age world had never before encountered. Their entire civilization was built for a different, more stable climate, and they were utterly unprepared for what came next. The first and most brutal blow was to the food supply. For the farmers of the Bronze Age, a drought measured in decades was not a hardship. It was an extinction-level event. Picture the endless fields of emmer wheat and barley that stretched across the Fertile Crescent, the very crops that fed the cities and filled the royal granaries. Under the unrelenting sun of the Great Drought, these fields would have baked into hard, cracked earth. The seeds would have failed to sprout, or the young shoots would have withered before they could ever form a head of grain. This was not a single lost harvest, it was a complete and total systemic failure, repeated year after hopeless year. Inside the great palace complexes, the consequences were immediate and terrifying. The massive storerooms, once bulging with surplus grain, began to empty. These granaries were the strategic reserves of the ancient world, the buffer that allowed civilization to function. They fed the scribes who kept the records, the artisans who forged the bronze weapons, and the professional soldiers who enforced the king's law. As the reserves vanished, the entire economic machine began to seize up. We have direct evidence of this panic from the city of Ugarit itself. A clay tablet from its final days records the price of grain, noting it had tripled. In our world, that would be like the price of a loaf of bread suddenly costing $30 instead of $10. It is the unmistakable economic signature of a society staring directly into the abyss of famine. Famine does not just bring hunger, it unravels the very fabric of society. A population weakened by starvation is a population stripped of its resilience. Disease spreads more easily among the malnourished. The social contract, the agreement that people will obey the king in return for security and order, shatters when the state can no longer provide the most basic necessity, food. Trust in the central authority evaporates. Farmers who could no longer feed their own families from the land would have abandoned their fields and poured into the cities, desperate for help that was not there. This created a volatile tinderbox of desperate, hungry, and angry people, all looking for someone to blame. The king, once seen as the intermediary with the gods, was now just the man who had failed to make it rain. The palace gods, themselves likely hungry, would find it harder and harder to maintain control. The great drought had not just parched the land, it had dried up the legitimacy of the state itself. But the collapse did not stop at the borders of a single starving kingdom. The same drought was striking every major power simultaneously, and in a world of profound interdependence, one kingdom's famine quickly became everyone's crisis. A society starving cannot sustain an economy built on abundance. The very arteries of the Bronze Age world, those vital sea lanes connecting Egypt to the Aegean and Anatolia to the Levant, began to harden and close. Picture the great merchant ships, their sails once billowing with promise, now sitting idle in silent harbors. Their hulls were meant to be filled with Cypriot copper and the even more critical Anatolian tin, the two metals that when combined created the bronze that gave the era its name. This was not a luxury trade, it was the foundation of industry and warfare. But with famine gripping every kingdom, the entire logic of commerce fell apart. What do you trade when you have nothing left to sell? The agricultural surplus that once bought these metals was gone. A farmer who cannot feed his family has no grain to send to the palace, and a palace with empty granaries has nothing to exchange for the foreign goods that keep its own specialists employed. The system of reciprocity, of you send me olive oil and I will send you fine textiles, shattered completely. One region's crop failure became a cascading disaster for its trading partners, a chain reaction of economic failure that respected no border. The most catastrophic loss was the tin. This metal was rare, often traveling thousands of miles from a handful of mines to reach the bronze workshops of the great kingdoms. As those supply lines were cut, the production of new bronze weapons, tools, and ceremonial objects ground to a halt. An army cannot fight with promises. A king whose soldiers are armed with broken or outdated bronze gear is a king whose power is visibly crumbling. The economic interdependence that had been the source of their collective strength now became their greatest vulnerability. The lifelines between empires were not just weakening, they were being severed with a brutal finality. Former partners, bound by treaties and royal marriages, now saw each other as rivals for the last scraps of food and the final shipments of vital metals. Cooperation gave way to a desperate, every kingdom for itself scramble for survival, turning a climate crisis into a tinderbox of human conflict. The same desperation that emptied the granaries also set entire populations in motion. As the drought strangled the land, people had a simple, terrible choice: stay and starve, or leave and risk everything. This is the human tide behind one of history's most enduring mysteries, the Sea Peoples. Egyptian temple walls at Medinet Habu show dramatic scenes of battle, with these invaders in distinctive horned helmets, their families and belongings loaded onto ox carts following their ships. For a long time, they were seen simply as barbarian hordes, a mindless force of destruction. But the modern understanding is far more tragic. These were not just warriors, they were entire communities on the move. They were climate refugees. Their homelands in the Aegean and Anatolia had become uninhabitable, the fields barren, the springs dry. They took to the sea with everything they had left, not to conquer, but to survive. Their journey was a desperate search for a place, any place, that still had food and water. This mass migration became the third domino to fall, and it landed directly on the fragile remnants of the Bronze Age world. The arrival of these desperate fleets was catastrophic for the coastal cities already reeling from their own internal crises. A kingdom like the Hittite Empire, its heartland devastated by drought, could not possibly muster the resources to defend its distant coastline. A city like Ugarit, its own people hungry and its army weakened, was in no position to repel a seaborne invasion of thousands of armed and desperate people. The Sea Peoples did not attack a healthy system, they stormed a house that was already on fire. Their movements were both a symptom of the total collapse and a final, violent accelerant. They clashed with the weakened but still standing kingdoms of the Levant and Egypt, adding one more unbearable strain. Imagine a town already struggling with food riots, its social order crumbling, and then seeing a fleet of ships appear on the horizon, carrying thousands of new mouths to feed and armed hands ready to take what they needed. The result was a chain reaction of violence that finished off states already on the brink. The Great Drought had created the refugees, and the refugees, in their desperation, delivered the final blow. But how did one empire, ancient Egypt, manage to survive when all others fell? Its story reveals the ultimate lesson in resilience. The fate of the Hittite Empire shows us what happens when even the most powerful civilization hits a wall it cannot overcome. Deep in the arid highlands of Anatolia, the Hittites had built a formidable superpower, yet their entire existence was a delicate balancing act. Their capital, Hattusa, was a masterpiece of engineering, a massive city protected by monumental walls that snaked across the hills. But those walls were powerless against the true enemy, a sky that refused to rain. The Hittite heartland was always a land of marginal agriculture, where successful harvests depended on just the right amount of seasonal rain. When the Great Drought began, it did not simply reduce their yields, it obliterated them. The fertile plains surrounding the capital turned to dust, and the royal granaries, the empire's lifeblood, began a swift and terrifying descent toward emptiness. We can hear the echoes of their desperation today, carved into clay, a series of surviving letters sent from the Hittite court to the pharaoh in Egypt reveal a shocking reversal of fortune. Once these were communications between equals, discussing royal marriages and military alliances. Now the tone is one of pure supplication. The Hittite king pleads not for gold or luxury goods, but for the most basic commodity of survival, grain. One famous letter states plainly that his people are dying, and only a shipment of Egyptian grain can save them. This was the ultimate humiliation for a warrior society, a public admission that their political sophistication and military might were utterly useless against the forces of nature. Why could Egypt sometimes send aid while the Hittites starved? The difference was the Nile. Egypt's agriculture was fed by the river's predictable annual flood, a system largely insulated from variations in rainfall. The Hittites, however, relied entirely on what fell from the sky. Their vulnerability was absolute. As the drought entered its second and third decades, the entire structure of the empire came apart. The famine within the capital weakened the army and shattered public faith in the king, who was seen as having lost the favor of the gods. At the same time, the trade routes that might have brought relief were severed, as every neighboring kingdom was fighting its own battle with starvation. Then came the final pressure, the movement of displaced populations, the so-called sea peoples pushing in from the coasts, attacking weakened outposts. The combination was lethal. There was no single battle that ended the Hittite Empire. Instead, there was a slow, grim unraveling followed by a final, silent act. The great city of Hattusa was not conquered in a legendary siege. It was simply abandoned. Its people, what was left of them, drifted away into the highlands, leaving the palaces and temples to the wind. The Hittite state vanished from history, leaving behind a powerful lesson that no amount of human power can secure a civilization against the environment that sustains it. Across the Aegean Sea, the same climatic chaos was dismantling another Bronze Age titan. The Mycenaean Greeks had built a world of fortified palaces and warrior kings, their power centers at Mycenae, Pylos, and Turins humming with administrative activity. These were not merely royal residences, they were the economic engines of their entire society. Scribes meticulously tracked incoming tribute, artisans crafted exquisite goods, and the central authority collected and redistributed grain to feed the population. This entire intricate system depended on one thing: a steady, reliable flow of agricultural surplus from the surrounding farmlands. When the Great Drought reached Greece, that flow did not just slow to a trickle, it stopped completely. The foundations of Mycenaean power were not stone, they were soil and rain, and both were failing. In the final, frantic days, the clay tablets written in the Linear B script capture a society on the brink of panic. They are no longer records of trade or religious offerings, but urgent military communiques. They speak of heightened alerts, of assigning watchers to guard the coast, a desperate attempt to see the threat coming. That threat was very real, likely the same seaborne migrations of desperate people pressing in from the Mediterranean. Yet these external invaders were only the final spark. The true tinder was the internal collapse fueled by years of hunger. A population that could not be fed would not remain loyal. The social contract between the Wanaks, the king, and his people shattered. What use was a central authority that could no longer provide food or security? The evidence points not just to invasion, but to internal rebellion, a violent uprising against a ruling class that had catastrophically failed in its most basic duty. The great palaces were not merely conquered, they were put to the torch in a wave of fires that swept across the Greek mainland. The destruction was so total and the collapse so profound that the complex knowledge of writing itself was lost. Greece plunged into a dark age that would last for centuries, a silence so deep that the memory of the Mycenaean world faded into myth, leaving only the crumbling ruins of Cyclopean walls as a testament to a greatness that drought had erased. Yet one civilization refused to vanish into the silence. While empires crumbled all around it, the new kingdom of Egypt endured. Its survival was not a story of escaping the crisis, but of weathering a storm that sank everyone else. The Great Drought and the desperate migrations of the Sea Peoples struck Egypt with the same ferocious intensity. The scenes carved into the mortuary temple of Pharaoh Ramesses III at Medinet Habu are not monuments to an easy victory. They are a testament to a desperate, existential fight for survival. They show chaotic naval battles with Egyptian archers firing from their ships into the vessels of the invaders, and fierce combat on land against warriors with feathered headdresses. Ramesses had to marshal every remaining ounce of his kingdom's strength to meet this dual threat of climate and invasion. So how did Egypt manage to stand when every other pillar of the Bronze Age world had fallen? The answer flows through the very heart of the nation. Egypt possessed a geographical miracle that no other contemporary power could claim: the relentless, predictable pulse of the Nile River. While the kingdoms of the Hittites and the Mycenaeans watched their rain-fed fields turn to dust, Egyptian agriculture operated on a different, more resilient system. Each year, the summer monsoon rains falling on the highlands of Ethiopia, thousands of miles to the south, would swell the Nile, sending a life-giving flood across the Egyptian floodplain. This was not a matter of hoping for local rain clouds to appear. It was a vast, continental-scale hydrological process that was largely immune to the drought conditions paralyzing the eastern Mediterranean. This annual event replenished the soil with fresh, fertile silt and provided the water needed to sustain a full growing season. The Nile was Egypt's ultimate strategic reserve, a natural buffer against climatic chaos. This does not mean Egypt escaped unscathed. The kingdom suffered terribly. Trade with its former partners evaporated, cutting off vital sources of copper, tin, and luxury goods. The constant military mobilization against the Sea Peoples drained the royal treasury. The internal social strain of supporting a population that may have swelled with its own refugees would have been immense. The Egypt that emerged from the collapse was a weakened, impoverished shadow of its former imperial self. Its survival came at a tremendous cost, marking the beginning of its long, slow decline from supreme power. Egypt's story offers the ultimate lesson from the Bronze Age collapse. Resilience is not about avoiding disaster, but about having a system robust enough to absorb the shock. For Egypt, that system was the Nile. For the Hittites, it was the rain, and when the rain failed, their entire civilization failed with it. The fate of empires was not just written by kings and armies, but by the invisible, unbreakable link between human society and the environment that sustains it. The true unraveling of these great kingdoms began not at their walls, but within their own hearts. A peasant farmer, his family gaunt with hunger, would have stared with hollow eyes at the cracked, barren fields that once promised life. For generations, his family had given a portion of their harvest to the distant palace, an agreement that traded their labor for the king's protection and the gods' favor. But now, in a third year of relentless drought, that contract was broken. The king had not protected them from the encroaching desert. The gods had not sent the rain. The palace gods still demanded the grain that did not exist, and the scribes still recorded the debt that could never be paid. In such a world, what loyalty could possibly remain? The central authority, once the unshakable pillar of society, was now seen as a parasite, a useless layer of elite consumption that contributed nothing to survival. This evaporation of faith was more dangerous than any foreign army. It turned subjects into rebels. Archaeological evidence from the burned palaces of Greece suggests the fires were not always the work of external attackers. In some cases, the destruction appears deliberate and internal, a violent rejection of the ruling class. It is not hard to envision a scenario where local populations, pushed to the absolute brink, saw the incoming Sea Peoples not as a terrifying horde, but as a potential catalyst for change. These desperate migrants, while armed, were also a clear sign that the old system was finished everywhere. Joining them, or at least stepping aside as they attacked the palace, might have seemed like the only chance for a new beginning. The collapse was therefore a dual revolution. It was an invasion from the outside, yes, but it was also a profound social uprising from within. The Great Drought did not just destroy crops, it destroyed legitimacy. When the people lost faith in their rulers, the intricate political structures of the Bronze Age lost their final defense, their own citizens. The final scribe in the palace at Pylos never knew he was the last. As the fires crackled closer, he laid down his stylus for the final time, and the intricate, swirling symbols of the Linear B script fell into an immediate and total silence. This was not an isolated event. In the ruins of Hattusa, the skill of carving monumental Hittite hieroglyphs vanished. Across the Near East, the complex cuneiform script, which had for centuries carried the diplomatic correspondence of emperors, simply ceased to be written. Literacy was not a common skill in the Bronze Age. It was an elite technology, meticulously taught and practiced by a small class of scribes who served the palace bureaucracy. When the palaces burned and the centralized economies that paid for these scribes disintegrated, the entire reason for their profession disappeared. There was no one left to dictate letters, to record tax receipts, or to write religious texts. The knowledge, painstakingly developed over generations, was extinguished in one. This was a loss more catastrophic than any single battle. It was a lobotomy of cultural memory. For the Greeks, it meant a plunge into an illiterate dark age that would last for more than 400 years. A silence so deep that the very existence of the Mycenaean world would fade into the stuff of Homeric legend. But the loss was not confined to writing. The economic networks that had supported other specialized crafts also shattered. Consider the bronze smith. His work required access to Cypriot copper and Anatolian tin, metals that no longer sailed the seas. Without the palace to provide these raw materials and to feed him while he worked, his complex, large-scale metalworking became impossible. He could no longer cast the great ceremonial cauldrons or forge the long, thrusting spears of a professional army. The technology regressed to small, local workshops, producing simpler, cruder tools. The same fate befell the architects and stonemasons. The knowledge of how to construct cyclopean walls or vast, columned palaces was no longer passed down because there was no king left to commission such grandeur. Society retrenched, turning inward and local. The intricate, interconnected civilization of the Bronze Age was replaced by smaller, simpler villages, their horizons shrunken, their skills focused on bare survival. This collective amnesia represents one of history's most stark civilizational resets. The lights did not just dim, they went out across vast regions, and it would take centuries for humanity to slowly, painstakingly, relearn what had been so suddenly forgotten. To blame the sea peoples for the entire collapse is to mistake a symptom for the disease. Egyptian carvings depict them as a terrifying, faceless horde, but this was the victor's narrative, a simplification for temple walls. The truth is far more complex and far more revealing. These seaborne groups did not emerge from a vacuum to attack a healthy world. They moved through a landscape that was already in an advanced state of decay. The Great Drought had already done its work, crippling agriculture, shattering trade networks, and eroding the authority of kings from Greece to Anatolia. The sea peoples were less an invading army and more a tsunami of desperation, their own homelands rendered uninhabitable by the same climatic catastrophe. Imagine a forest weakened by a blight, its trees brittle and dying. A strong wind will certainly finish them off, but the blight had already doomed the forest long before the storm arrived. The sea peoples were that final, catastrophic wind. They attacked states that were already hollowed out, their granaries empty and their armies weakened by years of famine and internal strife. A kingdom like the Hittite Empire could not repel these incursions because it was already fighting for its life against a much more relentless enemy, starvation. To see the sea peoples as the sole cause is to miss the entire first act of the tragedy. It ignores the decades of environmental stress that made the entire international system so fragile, so brittle, that it could be shattered by a single, final push. The real story is not one of a mysterious enemy, but of an interconnected world buckling under a pressure it never saw coming. A pressure that turned neighbors into rivals and sent entire populations searching for any refuge they could find. So what became of the world these people left behind? The silence after the fall was not empty. It was filled with the slow, difficult birth of something entirely new. The echoes of the Bronze Age collapse resonate with a chilling clarity in our own time. Our global civilization is a masterpiece of interconnection, far more intricate than the world of the Hittites and the Mycenaeans. We trade not just in copper and tin, but in microchips, pharmaceuticals, and vast streams of digital data. Our economic engine, like theirs, runs on a foundation of agricultural stability and predictable weather patterns. We have built a system of profound efficiency, but that efficiency has come at the cost of resilience. Consider a single modern example: a prolonged drought in a major grain-producing region like the American Midwest or the Ukrainian breadbasket. The immediate effect would be soaring global food prices, just as the clay tablets from Ugarit recorded 3,000 years ago, but the ripple effects would be far more complex and devastating today. That crop failure would disrupt supply chains for everything from livestock feed to biofuels, triggering economic instability and political unrest in nations halfway across the globe that depend on those imports. The Bronze Age world suffered from a scarcity of tin, halting bronze production. Our world could face a similar paralysis from a shortage of rare earth minerals essential for everything from smartphones to electric vehicles. The same principle is at play. A high degree of specialization and interdependence means that a break in one link can cause the entire chain to falter. Our modern equivalent of the sea peoples might not be invaders in ships, but mass migrations of climate refugees from regions rendered uninhabitable by rising seas or desertification, placing immense strain on borders and international relations. The ancient kingdoms discovered, to their ruin, that treaties and trade deals are meaningless when every partner is starving at the same time. This is the core vulnerability the Bronze Age warns us about, a system where everyone is connected, but no one has a backup plan. Our technological sophistication might make us feel secure, but it can also breed a dangerous complacency. The palaces of the past were brought down not by a lack of ingenuity, but by a failure to adapt to a changing world they did not truly understand. Their story forces a difficult question upon us. Have we merely built a more complex, more fragile version of their house of cards, one waiting for the next great shock to bring it all down? The trowel of an archaeologist does not just uncover history, it reads the story of a city's final day written in fire and rubble. At site after site, from Anatolia to Greece, excavators find the same grim layer, a distinct band of blackened earth, crumbled mud brick, and pulverized pottery. This is a destruction layer, the unmistakable crime scene of a civilization's violent death. In the Hittite capital of Hattusa, this layer tells of a citadel consumed by flames so intense they baked clay tablets hard, preserving their final, unread messages for 3,000 years. At the bustling port of Ugarit, the ash stratum seals a city that was never reborn, its grand libraries and merchant quarters silenced forever. And in the Greek citadel of Mycenae, the evidence is just as stark, a layer of destruction atop the once proud Lion Gate. What makes this pattern so chilling is its remarkable synchronization. These cities did not fall over the course of centuries. They were all shattered within a few decades of each other, right around 1200 BCE. This is not a story of separate, local conflicts. It is the signature of a single, continent-wide catastrophe. But perhaps the most telling clue is not the violence itself, but the profound silence that followed. These were not just damaged cities that were patched up and repopulated. Places like Hattusa and the Palace of Pylos were utterly abandoned, left to the elements for centuries. The ruins did not whisper of a temporary setback. They stood as stark, permanent monuments to a world that had ended. This widespread and lasting abandonment is the archaeological smoking gun, the tangible proof that the collapse was not a simple change of leadership, but a fundamental rupture in the very fabric of human society. The landscape itself was permanently scarred, leaving us to wonder what force could possibly erase so many great cities from the map, not just conquering them, but making them utterly irrelevant for generations to come. But the story of this collapse is a tapestry woven with more than one thread. While the evidence for a great drought is overwhelming, some archaeologists point to the very stones of the fallen cities themselves. At several key sites, excavators have found massive walls that did not just fall, but appear to have been shaken apart. Their foundations shifted, and their heavy blocks tumbled in ways that suggest the ground itself betrayed them. This points to another potential player in the disaster, a period of intense tectonic instability. A major earthquake striking a weakened city, its granaries already low and its people desperate, could have been the final, decisive blow that turned a crisis into a catastrophe. Imagine a kingdom already reeling from years of famine, its social order frayed, and then in a single violent minute, its defensive walls crumble and its royal palace is reduced to rubble. The psychological and physical damage would have been irreparable. At the same time, ice cores drilled from the glaciers of Greenland tell another part of the story. They contain a thin, acidic layer of ash dating to around this turbulent period, evidence of a colossal volcanic eruption, likely from Hekla 3 in Iceland or another unknown volcano. Such an event would have hurled millions of tons of sulfur dioxide and fine ash high into the stratosphere, creating a veil that scattered sunlight back into space. This volcanic winter would have plunged the entire region into a period of abrupt cooling, further shortening growing seasons and killing the crops that the drought had already left struggling. For a farming society, this combination of no rain and no sun was a death sentence. Yet most historians now believe that no single disaster, not even the megadrought, can fully explain the totality of the collapse. The leading theory today is one of systemic failure. The Bronze Age world had become a tightly coupled system, where a shock in one area created instant, cascading crises in all the others. The drought caused famine, which sparked internal rebellions and severed trade routes. The loss of trade crippled the military, making kingdoms vulnerable to earthquakes and invasion. The migrations of the sea peoples, themselves driven by the same climate pressures, then delivered the final, decisive push to states that were already on the verge of implosion. It was not a single cause, but a vicious feedback loop of interconnected disasters. Each problem amplified the others, creating a crisis that was far greater than the sum of its parts. This concept of a complex society becoming its own worst enemy holds a profound and urgent lesson for our own interconnected world. This intricate web of kingdoms functioned much like a living organism, a complex adaptive system where every part was linked to every other. Think of the modern internet, a network of incredible efficiency that can deliver information across the globe in an instant. But if a critical hub goes down, that same efficiency can cause cascading blackouts, severing connections for millions. The Bronze Age world operated on a similar principle. Its strength was its connectivity, the royal roads and sea lanes that bound it together. but this created a profound vulnerability. When the Great Drought struck, it was not a localized failure. It was a system-wide shock, a massive perturbation that rippled through every single network at once. The failure of harvests in Anatolia meant no grain for the Hittite army. A weakened Hittite army could not protect the tin trade routes from Anatolia. Without that tin, the bronze workshops in Greece and Egypt fell silent. The very connections that had been a source of collective wealth became highways for transmitting catastrophe. This is what systems theorists call a loss of resilience. The system became so optimized for a specific, stable set of conditions that it lost its ability to absorb a shock and bounce back. There was no backup plan, no redundant system. Every kingdom was leaning on every other, and when the drought pushed, they all fell together. The result was a catastrophic bifurcation, a sudden and irreversible flip from one state to another. The highly complex, globally connected world of palaces and scribes collapsed into a far simpler, disconnected reality, the isolated, village-based societies of the early Iron Age. The lights did not dim slowly, they were switched off all at once. This perspective forces us to ask a difficult question about our own world. We have built a global system of staggering complexity and efficiency, but have we, in the process, also built a trap? Out of the ashes of universal collapse, a profound silence descended. The grand palaces stood as empty shells, their storerooms bare and their archives crumbling to dust. The bustling ports were now ghost towns, their harbors silent, the great sailing ships either at the bottom of the sea or rotting on abandoned shores. The intricate network of kings and diplomats, of merchants and scribes, had been utterly erased. What followed was not a quick recovery, but a long, slow retreat into a simpler, harder way of life. Historians call this the Greek Dark Ages, but the shadow fell far beyond Greece. This was a time of radical simplification. With the collapse of long-distance trade, communities turned inward. The knowledge of writing, that elite technology, vanished completely from the Greek mainland. For over 400 years, not a single written word would be found there. Grand architecture and sophisticated art disappeared, replaced by humble pottery and simple villages. The population plummeted as people clustered in small, scattered settlements for safety and sustenance. The world had become smaller, poorer, and infinitely more local. Yet within this apparent emptiness, the seeds of a new world were quietly germinating. The very completeness of the Bronze Age's destruction had cleared the ground. The old power structures, the rigid hierarchies of god-like kings and immense bureaucracies were gone. In their absence, new forms of society began to emerge, built not on imperial command but on local identity and collective enterprise. Along the coast of the Levant, the Phoenician people, survivors from the chaos, began to thrive in a new way. Without a vast hinterland to dominate, they turned their eyes entirely to the sea. They became the new master traders of the Mediterranean, not as imperial agents but as independent city-states like Tyre and Sidon. Their greatest legacy was not a royal archive, but a revolutionary invention, a simple, accessible alphabet. This was not a script for a privileged few scribes, but a tool that could be learned by merchants and sailors, a democratization of knowledge born from necessity. In Greece, a similar transformation was slowly unfolding. The isolated villages gradually grew, coalescing into new communities that would become the famous city-states, the polis. Places like Athens and Sparta would not be born from the command of a wanax in a grand palace, but from the collective agreement of their citizens. The political experiments that would one day lead to democracy and oligarchy were made possible because the old, top-down model had been utterly swept away. The collapse forced humanity back to the drawing board. and the new blueprints they drafted in the ensuing centuries were for a world that was more adaptable, more resilient, and in some ways more human. The Great Drought and the chaos it unleashed did not just end an age, it created the conditions for an entirely new one to begin. Even in the deepest silence, the human instinct to adapt and rebuild refuses to be extinguished. One of the most profound legacies of the collapse was not a loss, but a remarkable gain: the rise of iron. This was not a discovery made in royal workshops, but a technology born from scarcity and desperation. With a great trade route severed, the vital tin needed for bronze became a ghost, a memory of a world that no longer existed. Bronze smiths, their forges cold, were forced to look elsewhere. They turned to a metal they had known for centuries but had largely ignored: iron. The process was difficult, requiring hotter, more carefully controlled furnaces to extract the metal from its ore. Early iron was often brittle, prone to rust, and for a time inferior to the finest bronze. But it possessed one overwhelming advantage: its raw material was everywhere. You did not need to control a mine in distant Anatolia or wait for a ship from Cyprus. Iron ore could be found in common hillsides and bogs across the entire Mediterranean world. This simple geological fact changed everything. The knowledge of metalworking, once a guarded secret of palace elites, began to seep out into the countryside. A local village could now have its own blacksmith, a person who could produce serviceable tools and weapons without any permission from a king or any reliance on a collapsed international system. This was the true revolution, the democratization of metal. The power to forge a plowshare or a sword was no longer centralized. It became dispersed, accessible to anyone with the skill and a local source of ore. This shift in technology directly enabled the shift in social structures that defined the new Iron Age. The age of the godlike king in his impenetrable bronze armor was over. Now a farmer could own an iron-tipped plow that broke the hard ground more effectively, and a militia of free citizens could be armed with iron swords. The very foundation of power had been broadened, moving from the exclusive hands of a few to the capable hands of the many, all because humanity, faced with the end of its world, was forced to find a new way. The broken pottery and burned palaces tell only part of the story. Today, the tale of the collapse is being rewritten in laboratories, where new scientific techniques are uncovering evidence invisible to the naked eye. Researchers are no longer limited to what they can dig up. They can now scan the very landscape from space. Satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar reveal the ghostly outlines of ancient riverbeds that once snaked through now arid plains, tracing the precise geography of the Great Drought. These vanished waterways are the lost arteries of the Bronze Age world, showing us exactly where life once flourished and then, catastrophically, failed. But the science goes even deeper, reaching into the bones of the people who lived through the disaster. Through a technique called strontium isotope analysis, scientists can drill a microscopic sample from a 3,000-year-old tooth. The chemistry of this enamel acts as a lifelong geographical signature, recording the water and food a person consumed as their tooth formed. When applied to skeletons found in mass graves from this period, this method can answer a heartbreaking question: were these people locals who died in a famine, or were they migrants who had traveled from a distant homeland only to perish in their search for refuge? This turns anonymous bones into individual biographies, confirming the scale and desperation of the population movements we call the Sea Peoples. Perhaps the most revolutionary tool is paleogenetics, the study of ancient DNA. By extracting genetic material from skeletal remains, scientists can now track the subtle tides of entire populations. They can see if a community's genetic makeup changed abruptly after the collapse, indicating an influx of new people. They can also search for the genetic markers of diseases like plague or typhoid, illnesses that would have spread like wildfire through a population weakened by famine and on the move. This allows us to move beyond abstract forces like drought and invasion, and to see the collapse as a human catastrophe, a perfect storm of starvation, sickness, and displacement that ravaged individual bodies and families. These cutting-edge tools are transforming a historical mystery into a detailed, human-centric narrative. We are no longer just studying the fall of palaces. We are beginning to understand the agonizing choices of a mother fleeing her parched village, the final days of a soldier defending a city whose granaries were empty, and the long, desperate journey of a family searching for a place where the rain still fell. Each scientific breakthrough solidifies the connection between a changing climate and the fragility of human society, painting a picture of the Bronze Age collapse that is both terrifying in its scale and deeply intimate in its details. A king's power is an illusion when the granaries are empty. In the face of a generational crisis, the quality of leadership became a matter of survival, and the starkly different fates of Egypt and the Hittite Empire reveal everything. In Egypt, Pharaoh Ramesses III understood that the threat was both environmental and military. He did not wait for the storm to break. He mobilized the entire kingdom, marshaling its remaining wealth to fortify the Nile Delta and build a fleet capable of meeting the sea peoples at sea. The triumphant carvings at Medinet Habu are propaganda, yes, but they are also proof of a state that could still act decisively, that could command the resources and loyalty to defend itself. This was crisis management on a grand scale, a unified, martial response that projected strength even in a time of profound weakness. Contrast this with the slow, grim unraveling in the Hittite heartland. The Hittite king was trapped. His letters to Egypt begging for grain were not just requests for food, they were public admissions of failure. A monarch who cannot feed his people is no longer a king in their eyes. As the drought tightened its grip, the very structure of the empire began to crack. Provincial governors in distant territories, seeing the central authority wither, would have begun to hoard what little grain they had. Why send your last reserves to a capital that can offer nothing in return, not even protection? These local rulers effectively broke away, fracturing the empire into smaller, desperate pieces. The king in Hattusa became a ruler of a crumbling city, his commands echoing in a hollow palace, his authority dissolving day by day. This paralysis was not a failure of character, but a failure of system. The Hittite state, for all its military might, was ill-equipped for an existential environmental challenge. Its power was built on conquest and tribute, not on resilient, localized food production. When the climate shifted, the entire logic of its governance collapsed. Effective crisis management rests on three pillars: legitimacy, resources, and the ability to command loyalty. The Great Drought systematically destroyed all three. A starving population withdraws its consent to be governed. Empty granaries mean you have no resources to reward allies or pay soldiers. And when you cannot protect your people or feed them, their loyalty evaporates, transferring to whoever can offer a chance at survival, even if that means a local warlord or a foreign invader. The collapse serves as a brutal historical lesson on the limits of centralized power. It demonstrates that the most sophisticated political institutions can become tragically fragile when the environment upon which they are built suddenly and violently changes. The silent testimony of pollen grains is rewriting our understanding of this ancient catastrophe. Environmental archaeologists sift through soil samples, their microscopes trained on a botanical graveyard of fossilized pollen and charred seeds. These tiny particles, preserved for millennia, are a direct record of the Bronze Age landscape. In layers of earth dating to the Great Drought, a dramatic and telling shift occurs. The pollen from water-loving trees like oak and pine, and from crucial cash crops like olives and grapes, plummets. These plants cannot survive without reliable rainfall, and their disappearance from the pollen record is a clear sign of relentless aridity. At the same time, the pollen of drought-resistant weeds, plants like sage and goosefoot, explodes in number. The land itself was transforming, turning from fertile woodland and cultivated field into a scrubby, parched environment. This is not a story told by conquering armies or fleeing kings, but by the plants themselves, and it confirms the drought was a long-term, devastating reality. The evidence continues in the remnants of the last meals. Archaeologists analyze seeds recovered from broken storage jars and the ashes of hearths. In the final days of the palaces, the seed types change. They find more remains of hardy, lower-yield cereals like millet, a crop that can survive in poor conditions but produces less food per acre. This is the signature of a society in agricultural triage, abandoning their prized olive groves and vineyards in a desperate attempt to grow anything that would sprout in the cracked earth. This ecological data offers a ground-level view of the crisis, proving that the drought was not a brief anomaly but a sustained environmental shift. It fundamentally altered the relationship between humans and their landscape, forcing farmers to make heartbreaking choices that ultimately could not save their world. The trauma of such a world-shattering event could not simply vanish from human memory. When written records were lost and cities lay in ruins, the only place left for this history to survive was in the collective imagination of the survivors, passed down through generations in the form of epic stories and sacred texts. The great collapse of the Bronze Age may not be recorded in history books from that time, but its echoes resonate powerfully in some of our most ancient legends. Take the epic cycle of the Trojan War, for instance. While the conflict between the Greeks and the Trojans is a foundational myth, its historical roots are often placed in the same turbulent era as the Great Collapse. The story of a massive, decade-long expedition by a coalition of Greek kings to sack a wealthy, fortified city on the coast of Anatolia feels like a folk memory of the widespread warfare, maritime raids, and the fall of great citadels that defined the end of that age. It is a tale of heroes and gods, but beneath the divine intervention lies a kernel of truth, a cultural recollection of a time when mighty cities could be destroyed and entire ways of life could vanish across the sea. A similar haunting echo can be heard in the biblical book of Exodus, the narrative of 10 plagues devastating Egypt, of a river turning to blood, of locusts and darkness, reads like a poetic catalogue of environmental disasters. A prolonged drought could easily explain the plague of blood, a phenomenon caused by toxic algal blooms that turn a river red and kill its fish. The ensuing plagues of frogs, insects, and pestilence are the logical consequence of an ecosystem in total collapse. The story culminates in the flight of a large population from a crumbling state, a powerful metaphor for the mass migrations that characterized the era. These stories were never intended to be factual history. They are something deeper, the way a culture processes and makes sense of an unimaginable catastrophe. When the world you know ends not with a whimper but with a series of fires, famines, and invasions, you explain it through the actions of angry gods or the fulfillment of divine prophecy. These myths are the psychological scars of a civilization, the enduring human response to a trauma so vast it could only be understood through the language of epic. The catastrophe was not confined to the Mediterranean world. Climate scientists now piece together a global puzzle. matching the story told by Mediterranean sea cores with ice drilled from the glaciers of Greenland and sediment layers pulled from the bottoms of ancient Chinese lakes. A startling pattern emerges. The same centuries that saw the palaces of the Hittites and Mycenaeans burn were a period of profound climatic instability across the entire planet. This was not a regional drought but a global climatic event. Far to the east, in the Yellow River Valley, the powerful Shang dynasty was in its final days. The archaeological and textual records hint at a period of upheaval, with the ruling elite increasingly preoccupied with divination and rituals, perhaps desperate appeals to the heavens as their world grew more unstable. The very character of their rule seems to have become more brittle, more oppressive, just as the foundations of their agricultural society were being shaken. It was in this turbulent context that the Zhou people from the western frontiers rose to challenge and ultimately overthrow the Shang, establishing a new dynasty that would reshape Chinese civilization. While the specific triggers were different, the underlying driver appears hauntingly familiar, a climate shock that tested the resilience of a complex society to its breaking point. This global perspective forces a humbling realization. The great collapse of the Bronze Age was not a unique, isolated tragedy. It was one particularly vivid and well-documented example of a broader pattern, a recurring theme in human history where a shifting climate acts as a great leveler, forcing the reorganization of societies from the Aegean Sea to the Yellow River. We see a world where disparate civilizations, completely unaware of each other's existence, were all simultaneously grappling with the same invisible planetary forces. Their shared vulnerability to a changing climate connects them across the millennia, offering a silent, sobering testament to the fragility of human achievement when the environment upon which it is built begins to move. The story of the Great Drought is ultimately a testament to both human fragility and our enduring capacity for reinvention. We have walked through the silent halls of Hattusa and witnessed the final, frantic tablets of Ugarit, tracing a chain of failure where climate change was the first domino that toppled economies, shattered social contracts, and erased empires from the map. This was not a simple story of a storm that passed, but a systemic collapse that proves no civilization, however magnificent, is insulated from the environment that sustains it. The essential lesson carved into these ancient ruins is that sustainability and resilience are not modern buzzwords. They are the fundamental prerequisites for survival. Our own world, with its deeply interconnected and highly specialized global systems, mirrors the Bronze Age in its strengths and, alarmingly, in its vulnerabilities. The choices we make today about how we build our societies, manage our resources, and respond to a changing climate will write the next chapter in this ancient story. The ghosts of the Bronze Age are not just a memory, they are a warning, urging us to listen to the whispers from the dust. If this journey into a lost world has resonated with you, we invite you to subscribe for more explorations into history's greatest mysteries. We would love to hear your thoughts on what these ancient lessons mean for our own time in the comments below.